Hi everyone, good afternoon. This is Rong from Aarhus University in Denmark. Today I'm going to talk about modeling thermostatus of pigs and cattle via a literature review. First, I will give a brief introduction of the background, presenting the heat transfer processes within the body and the heat exchange processes between the animal bodies and its surroundings, which will lead to a couple of questions where we are and what could be improved in terms of modeling the thermostatus of animals. Then I will present the methods that have been adopted in conducting the literature review. After that, I would like to share some of the findings and elaborate on those results a bit. Finally, I will present a short summary and share some of my own thought with you. Because of the metabolic heat production and the inquiry of maintaining the body temperature constant, the heat produced within the body must be released. So the heat can be released via convection because of the air movement around the animal's body if the air temperature is lower than the animal's body surface temperature. The heat can be released via thermal radiation between the animal's body surfaces and the surrounding surfaces. The heat can also be released via conduction, especially when animals are lying down. There is a big contact surface between the animal's body and the floor. And the heat can also be released via respiration. For cattle, part of the heat will be also released via the sweat evaporation if the cattle is sweating, because the cattle have sweat glands, but pigs don't have. Also, the cattle is normally raised in naturally ventilated barn with uninsulated roofs. So when we talk about heat exchange between the animals and their surrounding, solar radiation is another very important environmental factor to be considered. Okay, so let's say if the heat can be balanced within the animal's body, we say they are actually in the thermoneutral zone. It means that the heat can be released without extra effort. So what does it mean, extra effort? So, for example, when the animals are exposed to the heat stress, the body will do some physiological regulations. For example, they will increase the respiration rate. We call that is panting. They will regulate the skin blood flow rate so that more heat in the core body will be brought into the skin surface that can be released from there. We call this process is vasodilatation. And they can change their behavior. They can reduce the feed intake to reduce the metabolic heat production. So, we have talked about the heat exchange between the animals and the surroundings. And we also talked about the physiological responses when the animals are exposed to heat stress. There are studies actually focused on both sides individually, and there are very few actually can combine those two mechanisms in the modeling of thermostatus of animals. So, after we know the mechanisms of heat transfer within the animal body and heat exchange processes between animals and their surroundings, it actually brought us some questions. How has the thermostatus of pigs and cattle been modeled? Have we considered the heat accumulations? have we considered actually the physiological regulations continuously in the mechanistic models of thermostatus of animals? How have these models been applied in practical productions? And what could be improved in the future? So we looked into the literature trying to find out if we are able to find the answer for those questions. So we used the database of Web of Science of Scopers up to March of 2024. And the language is limited to English. And we use the words swine, or pig, or sow, or cattle, or cow in the keywords searching, combined with the keywords modeling or modeling. And then we used word thermal or heat searched in the abstract. And the literature review conducted following the protocol of ROSES. So because the literature review focuses on the heat transfer from the core body to the skin fur surfaces, and then it will be released from the surfaces to the surrounding environment. Therefore, the studies focus on the predicting the indoor thermal environment has been excluded. So we found 480 papers via the database of Web of Science and Scopers, and 2 from other sources. And there are 28 duplicates which removed. After title and abstract screen, we have 64 papers left for full papers reading. It turns out 23 for pigs and 39 for cattle. So here are some examples for predicting the or modeling the thermostatus of pigs. We divided them into empirical model, mechanistic model, and machine learning in the next slides. So what does it mean, empirical model? It means, okay, I have a responsive variable. Normally, for example, is skin temperature or rectal temperature. And then I have some environmental factors monitored in the bar. And then I try to use the regression equations to correlate the response variable and the model input. So basically, this empirical model, their forms relatively easy, but they're developed based on given conditions. So it's difficult to generalize them. Mechanistic model means that they are actually using the inputs, for example, the peak weight, the environmental factors like ambient air temperature, wind speed, and the relative humidity as the input, and then they describe the heat exchange processes, borrowing the heat transfer principles like convection, conduction, and radiation to predict the response variable like skin temperature and body temperature. So the machine learning models, they are basically correlate responsive data, and then based on the model input to predict the body temperature or the skin surface temperature, for example. So the empirical model was obtained from field tests or from the lab without considering the physical mechanisms of heat transfer, but analyzed data by employing multiple variable regressions. So the model is simple to use, but it's also difficult to generalize. It seems that there are more studies by have employed machine learning recently. However, how to verify and apply them in practice maybe need more attention. The mechanistic models focused very much on heat exchange between animals and the environment. We call this is passive system, but not much on how to connect the passive system with the active system, which describes the physiological regulations. We have looked into the literature and found that there are very few studies actually working where we can find physiological regulations for pigs. So it means the experimental data collected from tests on the physiological regulations of pigs are very valuable for developing a mechanistic model that can combine or integrate the physiological responses into the mechanistic modeling of the heat exchanges or heat transfer, so that we can apply them into controller and or digital twins. For cattle, there are also many empirical models which has not been presented in these slides. The most well-known is THI index that is used to assess or predict if the cattle is under stress or not. And there are different revised versions of THI by considering maybe airspeed influence, radiations influence, and then convert them or predict effective temperature that the cattle can perceive. And there are also more studies actually found in the literature about the mechanistic model. And the machine learning actually has been used for many years in the studies focusing on cattle to predict like rectal temperature, respiratory rate. One good example is one study from 1994 and 2005. So for the cattle, many studies developed thermal indices to assess the heat stress of cattle, although they are not shown on the slides. Machine learning was adopted more than 2 decades ago for predicting the heat stress of cattle. More studies actually can be found recently. However, one of the challenges could be if the large amount of data is available for training and optimization of those models. Generally, the mechanistic model studied the heat exchange between animals and their surroundings, and the thermoregulation mechanisms individually. Studies combining those mechanisms are quite few. It is noticed that physiological, behavioral, and production indicators interact with each other, but they have been examined separately to facilitate the analysis. So what we could do is, how could we actually, to integrate the physiological responses of animals to describe these mechanisms by mathematical expressions that can be integrated into the mechanistic models of the heat transfer and heat exchange between the animals and surroundings. And it has been recognized that heat accumulation is very critical when assessing the heat stress for animals. So maybe it is required more work of modeling that can consider the dynamic heat transfer processes so that it can better serve in identification of heat stress of animals when it starts, while at the same time, we can minimize the energy and water consumption that is needed for the cooling system. So because of the limitation of the time, I will finish my presentation now. If you have any questions, I'm ready and happy to answer because I will be online. Thank you.